Tony Soprano mauled his way into our hearts 24 years before Cocaine Bear hit the silver screen. His brutality, understated cunning, and corrupt moral code infested the collective consciousness, spawning anti-heroes like the mildew in Tony's basement. These 6 seasons defined television for decades. Prepare to be an accessory after the fact, because here's how The Sopranos created modern television as we see it. Spoilers ahead. Rewind the proverbial clock to 1999. David Chase has already been passed by Fox for his spec scripts, and HBO is delaying the release of the first episode. The writer is at the precipice of an enormous crossroads. On one hand, he'd love for HBO to drop the pilot. Chase had aspirations as a filmmaker and had grown tired of TV after 2 decades in the medium. When he wrote the first episode, it was supposed to be a movie, so it was no great loss to Chase. That seems to be the most important factor in The Sopranos' origins. David saw The Sopranos much like Tony saw therapy, a way to explain, and more importantly, understand his mother's effect on his life. In an interview with 60 Minutes, he said as much himself.
My mother was sort of the model for Livia Soprano.
David Chase took a page from the storytelling book centuries older than the aqueducts of Rome. Because, like Aesop before him, Chase took real events from his life and channeled them into his work. Livia Soprano, the narcissistic mother of the mob, was a stand-in for Chase's own mother. While she never tried to order a hit on her son, she was overly pessimistic and hysterical, as Chase puts it, going so far as threatening to stab his eye with a fork, and thought Adriana's death was cruel.
You being sarcastic.
This seems like just a fun tidbit of information, but it is extremely important to the rest of The Sopranos' development. David Chase wasn't writing a mafia movie. He was writing about a dysfunctional family who happens to be in the mafia, which, as the late great James Gandolfini puts it, is itself about family. Because Chase pinned The Sopranos to a real family dynamic, it allowed the show to be more than violence, nudity, and gabagool. It gave it a heart, smoldering and charred as it may be. Audiences tuned in for the gangsters, but stayed for the compelling storytelling and character depth, a feat made possible by the slow, methodical storytelling that The Sopranos popularized. Think back to AJ's brief stint as a nihilist. We'll discuss this more in-depth later. A setup in Season 2 that isn't thematically paid off until the very last season. If David Chase had gone with his gut and kept The Sopranos episodic, then we would never have the complex growth of AJ's depression. No flack to the standalone episodes like College, either. These episodes gave us room as an audience to breathe and explore the characters as people. The important part is the push and pull happening behind the scenes is what gave us the masterpiece we eventually saw on our televisions. Give a man a fish and teach him for a day. Teach a man to talk to a fish, and he has a Lynchian awakening realizing the informant in his gang. This is far from the first time, nor is it the last, The Sopranos has taken inspiration from an acclaimed auteur. In fact, watch half a season of The Sopranos, and you'll find a smorgasbord of examples. Not only Lynch, but other famous auteurs like Kubrick, Hitchcock, and of course, Coppola. This sets Sopranos apart from its peers. Not to say there weren't inspired cinematic moments in other series, just none as prevalent as we see in North Caldwell, New Jersey. Obviously, the dreams are ripped straight from Twin Peaks. The surreal elements, the future predictions, and even down to the non-diegetic sounds that play over these scenes. Salvatore's fish body is a far cry from the dancing little person and backward-talking Black Lodge, but they share the same blood. Just a quick coma and a few seasons away takes us to the last episode. Don't take your hats off just yet, because we aren't staying in the diner long. The cinematographic technique we're talking about is all over the episode, but the diner is where it shines the most. When Tony walks in, he looks at the table he is going to sit. We, as an audience, see him already at the table. Tony peering into the future is the spiritual successor to 2001. When David Bowman sees himself as an old man, it is supposed to symbolize time is meaningless to him now. When Tony does it, it's a lot less literal. But this sort of cerebral storytelling was not as common as it is today.
Perhaps I'm just projecting my own concern about it.
Hitchcock is such a powerhouse. He must come first in any sentence mentioning him. Ignore the last time I mentioned him. What better proof of his fingerprints than in Season 4, Episode 11? Calling All Cars is a great episode, but I want you to focus on yet another dream sequence. If this house scene was entirely in black and white, it would look eerily similar to Psycho. The old Empire-style building, the framing, down to the dark, foreboding elderly woman peering down from the stairs feels like a missing scene in the thriller icon. Which brings us to the godfather of mobster movies, pun intended, The Godfather. We could cover the lighting, framing, and even blocking that has been inspired by this Coppola classic, but the most evident is Tony's first assassination attempt. Episode 12 is unique in a lot of ways, but when Tony buys his OJ and walks to his car, fans should have been wary. His actions are literally framed to mirror that of Vito Corleone, putting it in conversation with The Godfather. And though he wasn't the head officially yet, any gangster buying citrus on the street should be careful. Though maybe that's why Sopranos survived. He actually bought these symbolic oranges, owning his future in a way. I may have gotten too in the weeds with that one. Moving on. Every show is only as good as its worst character. Depending on your preference, this could be anyone in The Sopranos. But no matter who you dislike most, you can't deny almost every recurring character is a three-dimensional human with wants, needs, and flaws. Meaning, no matter who is in an episode or scene, the dynamic range of emotion and relationships is palpable. Take the main cast, for example. We've got to start with the made man who made men shiver, Anthony John Soprano. The entire series is framed around his therapy, trying to solve his panic attacks. But what stems from this simple plot device is a complex, in-depth dive into the mind of a criminal, and more importantly, a human. Tony Soprano is not your classic mafia boss of the Gilded Age, a brutal, self-loathing criminal mastermind suffering from existential and moral issues every day in his life. Tony is the stoic, toxic man of the past, demanding respect and submission from those around him, as well as a mentally tortured and victimized son attempting to better himself. Struggling to meld these two identities fractures Tony. He starts to wonder which is the true face, and they start to bleed into one another. His criminal life starts interfering with his family man persona, and his secret goal to better himself starts undermining his criminality. Gifting Meadow her own friend's car, vying for her affection by hurting those she respects, and deciding not to take out Meadow's pedophilic coach, attempting to better his own response to anger. A quintessential anti-hero that started it all. Tony Soprano walked, so Walter White could run, so Homelander could fly. Next, there's the woman that molded the monster. Sure, Tony would sooner give his father, uncle, or even cousin credit for molding him. But if he were more honest with himself, his toxic mother truly planted the seeds of his personality. Livia Soprano is an abusive, pessimistic black hole of a human being. She represents the core duality that made The Sopranos the artistic masterpiece it is. She never gets her hands dirty in the show, always skating on the line of legality. Even when those closest to her stand neck-deep in an ocean of blood and violence, she floats above. Yet, she is probably the worst person we see on screen. Shrewd, hypocritical, and manipulative Livia had nothing but her own interest at heart, a trait she passed to her children. And the show wants you to know that.
Well, a boy's best friend is his mother.
AJ is the Tony that never got to be, but it comes with a price. Like his father before him, he is prone to depression and anxiety, even experiencing some of the criminal worlds and heading down the same twisted path. His self-discovery and affluence were paid with blood, a debt he will repay like The Sopranos which begot him. Nothing shows that better than Tony's wink at the funeral of a young AJ. That brings us naturally to, theme is always a tricky subject for TV. Rarely could they cover darker, heavier issues. There were, of course, some that ventured into these murky waters, but never too deep so as not to offend the public morality. Here are only some of the themes explored in The Sopranos. You have your classics, like what makes a man evil? Tony says he isn't going to hell because he's a soldier, killing because he is at war and needs to survive. A war he actively chose and continues to choose to be a part of. The show was groundbreaking for the sheer cruelty that is Tony's violence. College is touted as one of, if not, the best episodes, where he strangles Fabian Petrulio for being an informant simply because he recognized him, a fact that muddled Tony's philosophy. If he had no choice in the evil deeds done, what caused him to follow and subsequently kill Petrulio? If it's a code, why has he chosen to adhere to a code that forces him to do evil deeds? College changed the course of TV by introducing the public to levels of violence not yet seen by a protagonist. Brutal, criminal violence. But it also forces us to reevaluate our own morality watching the show. Determinism is the idea that we truly have no free choice in life. Be it religious or simply philosophical, Tony is adherent to the belief to rectify his own actions. Unlike Dexter and Walter after him, this anti-hero will not and cannot see himself as an agent in his own destiny. Like in his dream, he sees himself as being driven through his life by the eons of tradition and rules he is expected to uphold. This is an extremely dense topic, and the surface hasn't even been scratched yet. Imagine what it was like to tune into HBO on a Sunday evening and have to reckon with your own thoughts of free will. Now, imagine those were the lighthearted episodes. Death and the afterlife are a huge part of not only The Sopranos, but any mafia media. Murder and mayhem have a consequence after all, but the show took it darker than before. We as a society find the macabre and sullen far scarier than the gory or bloody. The understated darkness that lurks in our psyche is the one true fact we all must face. Probably makes it extremely hard to be a varsity athlete with that on the mind, if you ask me.
What is it with you and this obsession with this varsity crap?
Sopranos was unique because it depicted death in a way we couldn't escape it. Death was quick, horrific, and permanent, and it tackled the afterlife with surgical precision. Not just the metaphysical what happens after we die, but the literal life after someone is gone. The ramifications of people's deaths are felt forever in the show like it is in life. Tony's mother dying is directly responsible for Richie being killed. Don't believe me? Rewatch that season again. Everything builds on everything. Themes on top of themes, it's turtles all the way down. Not talking about TV's most talked about ending is a crime worse than racketeering. This is the reason why you and I are talking about The Sopranos to this very day. The inexplicable blackness represents life's fragility. How it all can be taken away with a snap of a finger is haunting, to say the least. A daring Kaufman-like choice that sets Sopranos apart as an artistic work more than a piece of entertaining media. The questions that plagued audiences: for all we know, a homunculus pops out of AJ and dances to the music. Not to mention Journey's Don't Stop Believin'.